Hello again. Thank you all for joining us. This is our fourth and final webinar in this series presented by the Project on Workforce at Harvard. As we wait for everyone to join, I just wanted to encourage everyone to visit and follow our LinkedIn page. It's the best place to find out the latest on our research, on our events, eventually on job opportunities. And we've also shared a post about this very talk where you can add comments, questions, and follow along if you will. Let's get started. I'm Nathalie Gazzaneo, and I'm one of the co-directors at the Project on Workforce. For those of you joining us today or just like getting to know us, the Project on Workforce is a cross-disciplinary collaborative project between the Harvard Kennedy School, the Harvard Business School, and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And at the project, we produce basic and applied research at the intersection of education and labor markets for leaders in business, in education, and public policy. Today is the final webinar in our series, and we'll discuss the changing nature of work, focusing particularly on generative AI. What skills are becoming more valuable? What does this even mean for education and for work? And I'm very glad to be joined today by my colleague, Ben Weidmann. Ben is an economist with a background in education, and his research focuses on identifying the skills that matter in the labor market, such as teamwork and decision-making, and building tools to measure these skills. When Ben completed his PhD at Harvard, he co-founded and he's currently the director of research of the Skills Lab, which aims to broaden the sets of skills that we measure in work and education settings to include essential skills like teamwork and leadership. Ben, so great to be joined by you today. Welcome to the Dialogue series. And can you start off by grounding us on the value of social skills? Why are they relevant for education and for work?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for having me, Natalie, and hi, everyone. Um, yeah, so social skills. I'd like to start maybe with a little bit of history. So about 100 years ago, when academics first became interested in measuring human capacities, they weren't just interested in abstract intelligence, the kind of thing that ultimately turned into IQ tests. They were also super interested in social intelligence. Um, and so this idea that social skills and social intelligence are important has been there from the very start of modern approaches to measuring human skills. The trouble was really that social intelligence turned out to be really hard to measure. And so it kind of faded into the background quite a lot over the course of the 20th century, really until the 1990s, when there was a resurgence of interest in social skills, particularly in terms of the labor market, which is what I've mostly been interested in as an economist. Um, and there's kind of a big long run trend that underpins this resurgence of interest, which is that in modern economies, production is increasingly oriented less around individual workers and much more around teams, right? So you can see this in a bunch of different industries, and there are really great case studies sort of showing how production has shifted from focusing on individuals to teams. My favorite toy example is from songwriting. So it turns out that in the 1960s, if you were to look at the Billboard Top 100 songs, about 5 of them would have been written by a team of songwriters, so 5 out of 100. But today it's more like a third. So over 30 of the songs in the current Billboard Top 100 were written by teams of songwriters. And you see this in a bunch of different industries. So it's sort of like a cross economy phenomenon. And so as you've had this rise of teamwork and people doing much more work in teams, there's been like a renewed emphasis in social skills, which are kind of crucial to teamwork being productive. So I think that's sort of like the core of it, why we're interested in social skills in particular. I'll just say one more thing, which is that my colleague Dave Deming wrote this great paper showing how the value of social skills has increased pretty dramatically since the 1980s, which is sort of our data window. So he showed that not only are people doing much more sort of team activities and teamwork-based production, but that the relative earnings of people who are good at teamwork and who have social skills have gone up a lot. And I think that's really striking and quite surprising to some people because this was a period where we saw the introduction of the personal computer and the rise of the internet, and definitely in popular consciousness, it seems like, STEM skills and sort of abstract reasoning skills are really strongly valued in the labor market. But it turns out that as a whole, across the economy, social skills and professions that rely on social skills have done incredibly
Mm-hmm.
well over a very long period now. Lawyers, doctors, teachers, managers, all of those kind of things. So yeah, I think this is like a really sort of big deal in terms of modern economic production, and yeah, I think that's sort of the landscape as I see it.
Yeah, this is great. And Ben, you know that we recently released some really interesting nationally representative survey data showing that workers in the US, we're looking into the US specifically, including about like 1 in 5 blue collar workers and workers without a college degree, they are adopting generative AI at an impressive pace. We'll continue tracking this trend, but these early results already like strike to me as telling us that people are using this form of technology that creates things, that is creative, across many different occupations and tasks. How may this trend that we are seeing potentially impact the value of social skills? And do they become more or less valuable as Gen AI gets adopted in the labor market?
Yeah, so this is a really great question, and one that we think about a fair bit at the
Mm,
Skills Lab. I think the truth is it's too early really to say, even though a lot
mm,
of people have adopted Gen AI in their workflows. I, I don't want to sit on the fence, so I'll say my overall guess is
mm,
that the ability to work in a team and to manage a team is going to continue to grow in value, regardless of
mm,
whether you're working in teams of people or if your teams also include AI agents.
mm,
And I'd love to talk a bit more about that. But it might be worth sort of just like sketching out the landscape of what we do know from studies where we've looked at companies and firms that have adopted Gen AI tools. And so
mm,
there have been some great pieces of research on this in the last couple of years. And they've spanned a bunch of different industries. So customer service, tech support, software engineering, management consultancy. Um, and I think the dominant finding of those experiments where people go in and they observe sort of the productivity of workers before and after the adoption of Gen AI tools, the dominant finding is that people who benefit most are people who usually have less experience and less skill to start with. So Gen AI in that
mm,
sense is a big skill leveler. It helps
mm,
people who start off at a lower level get up towards expert level. The
mm,
problem with the research that we have so far and sort of the gap in our knowledge is that it's focused on these like single tasks, right? So we have a good sense that if you introduce a Gen AI tool, it can help people sort of raise their level. Um, what we don't know is what general skills are complements for working with AI, right? So it's
mm,
like we know something about the specific skills. What we don't know is about general human capabilities and what, the kinds of
mm,
things that we could teach people to be able to do, how we could reorient our education systems. So
mm,
we recently ran an experiment that tried to sort of make some progress on this. And our hypothesis was that people with good self-knowledge would benefit most from getting AI assistance. And so
mm,
self-knowledge here is something like being appropriately confident. So if I ask you a
mm,
question and you say you're completely sure, someone with good self-knowledge would be right 100% of the time. If I
mm,
asked them a question and they said, I'm just guessing, it's 50-50, I don't really know, they would turn out they would be right 50% of the time. So they have
mm,
a really good sense of what they know and what they don't know.
mm,
And in our experiment, what we do is we bring people into the lab and we have them do this experimental task. And we find two things. We find first that this like skill leveling effect exists,
mm,
right? So the people who initially start off at a lower level of expertise benefit a lot. But we also find that the people who benefit most are the people who have good scores on this measure of self-knowledge.
mm,
Um, and so, like, not for nothing, I think that's also a really useful skill if you're working with humans in just regular teams. And that sort of brings me back to my core guess, which is that the main skills of teamwork and management are going to become more valuable after we have widespread adoption, particularly of Gen AI agents. In part just because I think like these agents, they're animating technology, if you like, is human language. So they have like in the vast space of possible intelligences, they are quite human-like. So I kind of, my guess is that over time, these kind of skills that we're trying to measure, social skills and management skills, I think they're going to become more valuable rather than less.
This is so fascinating. Part of what I'm hearing, Ben, is you saying that these results, they may suggest that some of the qualities that are really good and helpful and useful for people working with other people, they may also be helpful for people to work better and more productively with Gen AI, right? Let's delve maybe like a bit more into teamwork, since you like mentioned that a few times already. We know that most jobs require teamwork, like you're mentioning that as you're providing more context on the importance of social skills and social intelligence. And I know that your work has also helped illuminate some of the characteristics, the attributes of people who are good team players. Can you share more about that work specifically?
Yeah, I'd love to. So let me start by sort of trying to define what we mean by a team player. So it's someone who, when you add them to a team, improves that team's performance, even if they're not good at the specific task that the team's working on. So we really try and draw a distinction between like task skills on the one hand and teamwork skills on the other. So as an example, like imagine you take a team of people who are trying to solve chess puzzles, some toy example, and you add a chess grandmaster, someone who's amazing at chess, to the team. The team very likely is going to improve its performance at solving these puzzles, but that doesn't mean that the chess grandmaster is a team player in our definition or the way that we measure it. So in contrast, if you add someone to a chess playing team who's never played chess before, and that team improves their performance, then that person's much more likely to be a team player. They're doing something to help the team dynamics, to help the way the team operates. So that's kind of what we mean by a team player.
Why is that? Can you?
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess there's like I guess there's different things that you can do to help a team. And when we try and do the teamwork measurement, what we're really trying to do is decompose the way that people can contribute to success. And our measurement approach isolates how good you are at the specific tasks, and then also the impact that you have, I think, primarily through the way that you interact with your teammates and help them become the best versions of themselves. Right? So there's sort of like two ways in which team players, at least in our experiments, seem to help their team succeed. So the first one is just about motivation. So there's some evidence that if you're in a group with like someone that we're calling a team player, you just try harder. You have more energy and you are able to stay on task for longer. The second big thing is about deciding what you should do. So this comes back to this idea of knowing your own strengths and being willing to let other people shine. So to give you an example, like from my own life, say your background is in statistics and you're on a research team. And it becomes pretty obvious pretty early on that someone else on the research team is better at statistics than you are. Like at that point, well, firstly, you need to acknowledge that. And then secondly, you need to think to yourself, like, how else can I contribute to the team? Are there other things that I can do to help the team improve, right? So it might be, helping to do project implementation. It might be spending more time on writing up the analysis in the report. So in our experiments, and then I think more broadly in life, being a good team player means realizing that like what you're trying to do is not optimize your own performance, but figure out what you can do to help the team. And a big part of that is having a clear impression of like what you're good at and what your teammates are good at. So
I love how this idea of knowing your strengths and knowing your weaknesses, and maybe like having, the drive to still make a good contribution keeps coming up. Both are explained, our research with AI agents and teamwork. there's also like a very special type of teamwork, and or maybe like a position in teamwork, which is like managing other people while you play with them, right? Um, how how is the importance of these skills different for good managers or people who work in teams managing other people? Who are the good managers? And maybe like even more interesting than that, who are they not?
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's a great question. So um, we tried to extend our work on teamwork to answer this exact question, where we
Mm,
introduced hierarchy into our different measures, and we set some people up as managers and some people up as line workers, and we have them
mm,
do a bunch of different experimental tasks. One of the things that we were really interested in was the extent to which we could identify good managers. And so we tested
mm,
these two different ways of promoting people in a lab setting. And so the first was what we called self-promotion. So we bring people to the lab and we basically like explain everything that they're going to do, and then ask them how much they want to be in charge of a team.
mm,
And so in the self-promotion world, the people who are managers are just the people who most want to be in charge. So that's kind of regime one. And then as a baseline, we compare that to just randomly choosing managers. So people come to the lab and, we randomly choose some people to be managers and the other people, they perform the roles of workers. Um,
mm,
we were a bit surprised to find that on average, the self-promoted managers did worse, a little bit
mm,
worse than the people who were just randomly chosen. So the people who really wanted the job typically weren't the best at it.
mm,
Um, there are a couple of explanations that jumped out to us as to why,
mm,
and they both focus on overconfidence. So we
mm,
measured general overconfidence, so the extent to which people overrated their performance on a bunch of different tasks. And it
mhm,
turned out that the people who really wanted to be in charge were just generally more overconfident. They had this sort of inflated sense of their
mhm,
contributions. Um,
mhm,
and it was especially noticeable in terms of their social skills. So we measure social skills two different ways. First, we ask people to self-report on their social skills. So they respond to statements like, I understand people very well, always
mm,
true. Or I always instinctively know the right thing to say or do when I'm dealing with a group of people. So statements like that.
mm,
And the people who really wanted to be in charge tended to rate themselves very highly on these
mm,
like self-reported measures of social skills. But we also do a skills-based assessment, which in our case was a measure of emotional perceptiveness. So
mm,
this is like the extent to which you're able to read emotions on people's faces and pick up on subtle cues about how
mm,
other people are feeling. And there was a pretty strong negative association for
mm,
people who wanted to be in charge between their self-reported people skills, so they're out there saying like I'm a people person, and on the other hand, their kind of like skills-based measure of emotional perceptiveness, which is a proxy for emotional intelligence and more broadly just social skill.
mhm,
So I think that was like on the question of like who's a good manager. I think we should be really careful about trying to cast the net as wide as we can because the people who just put their hand up first are probably unlikely to be the best candidate. Which kind of raises the question of like who should we pick and what were the
mm,
characteristics that were associated with people doing a really good job. And there were kind of three big things.
mm,
So we had this test of decision making skill, which I think is super relevant in general for management. And what the test tries to do is measure your ability to make good decisions when you're just being bombarded by a stream of increasingly complex information. So the
mm,
question is like, can you take that big sort of like fire hose of information and focus on the part that's most important to the problem? So can you direct your attention in a strategic and smart way? So that
mhm,
was a test that really predicted who was going to be good on our management task. And then we saw three other things. So one was like the good managers did a good job of matching their workers to tasks to maximize the kind of skills that they had available.
mm,
They did a really good job of monitoring. So, that if someone was struggling, they would help. If someone was wasting their time on a task that wasn't really contributing to the team, they would intervene. And they were also really good motivators. So the good managers in our experimental setup make sure that people like stay at a high level of effort and engage throughout the task, which is actually quite hard to do because it's quite a long task. And people get tired and bored. So, which I guess they do at work as well. So yeah, matching, monitoring, and motivation were the three things
Yeah. Yeah.
that we.
Then as you were speaking, I was just like thinking to myself and wondering, like, were there any gender nuances like to these findings that you explored in these Good Managers research or other demographic
Yeah.
nuances that you could share?
So I think one of the most robust findings from all our experiments so far is that this is in teamwork and management, is
Mm-hmm.
that there just aren't big demographic differences about
Mm,
who's going to be a good team player and who's going to be a good manager. So as you can imagine, like in all of our experimental work, we subject people to like a very large number of tests and we measure loads and loads of things about them. Their background, their ethnicity, their age, their income.
mm-hmm.
Um, and it turns out that most of those factors are not predictive of the causal contribution that they make either as a teammate or as a manager.
Mm,
Um, and that's especially true of gender, which I think is kind of telling in that. I mean, if you look at the demographic profile of managers and leaders, it's certainly not just like a uniform slice of
right,
the.
right.
Uh,
That's
Whereas,
what
like,
got me
our
thinking.
results suggest that there is no big like demographic predictor of who's going to be a good manager. So I think that suggests like room for improvement, and also comes back to this idea of like casting the net as widely as possible when you're doing
Mm-hmm.
like manager selection or identification.
Yeah. Very interesting. Can we maybe like walk back to Gen AI a little bit? One thing, Ben, that you mentioned in the beginning was that this role of Gen AI as a skill leveler, right? And how you like in this research with human to human work and human work with Gen AI, how these like helped illuminate maybe like the reasons behind or additional information behind what makes Gen AI a better skill level, like with certain people, given people like use it differently, right? So one thing that I was wondering is like what might be the some I know this is like early research, but what might be like interesting insights from this piece of research specifically on performance inequality or labor market inequalities? Like, is there anything that strikes to you?
About the likely impact on labor market inequality of
Yeah, or
Gen AI.
or performance if you look into like a smaller setting, like into performance inequality. How can we improve that since the effects are different?
Yeah, that's another great question that I don't have a terrific answer to. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really early days. Um, I do think that as you mentioned, with the kind of skill leveling idea, that the results are reasonably encouraging early on, about the likely kind of impact in terms of the productivity distribution, which
Mm-hmm.
in theory should translate into wages as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm a little bit nervous about, I'm more nervous about predicting on that front because I think it depends more on the type of technology that we get and the way in which it's implemented and also the sector. Like I'm more confident about making general predictions on the value of like being able to interact with other agents and manage other agents.
Mm-hmm.
I think the question about inequality is at least less clear in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. And Ben, what does this all that you mentioned here, including like this research on Gen AI, mean for people like educators and business leaders who are really eager to take action on these insights? What can they do? Can we teach the skills that really help people work better with other people and work better with AI agents?
So I think yes.
Hmm.
Um, on the education front, there are many curricula out there that sort of explicitly try to teach teamwork and collaborative problem solving and management. I think sadly, very few of those courses and curricula are evaluated in a kind of causal way, which makes it really hard to both improve the courses and it makes it hard to get like public funding and public buy-in, especially I think in K-12 education. So
Mm,
you mentioned that my background is in education. What I was doing before I went to grad school was trying to help design randomized controlled experiments in school education to basically make it better.
mhm,
And over 90% of the experiments that we funded and worked on were focused on reading and writing and math and science outcomes. And that wasn't because like the educators were only interested in those things, but it was because those are the things that we had really good outcome measures for, right? So we ended up putting a huge amount of our research effort into the areas where we had good, reliable, scalable measures. And so I found that quite frustrating, that we were so sort of narrow in our focus, despite everyone's goodwill and the efforts to make the curriculum broad. So that really motivated me to go back to grad school and on working to make these kind of measures of things that people fairly universally acknowledge are valuable, but that we don't have good measures for. I think we're making good progress on that front, but our approach is still reasonably experimental and quite logistically demanding, which is one area where I think actually Gen AI might be really helpful. And so we're piloting an approach right now where, we try to measure teamwork and management skills, where people work with a combination of humans and AI agents to make the measures more scalable and cost effective. So that's kind of on the measure side. I think on the organization side, I would just echo the point that I made about casting a net as widely as possible. I think if you look at surveys of how people do, especially promotions into initial or junior managerial positions, it's almost all based on interviews or supervisor judgments, which have some signal for sure, but also subject to some pretty well-known biases. And so I think casting the net wide and using skill-based assessments where you can could give you quite a big edge in terms of finding promising managerial talent.
This is great. I think, Ben, this takes me like to a quick call to action that if someone like us in the audience today, if you are involved in hiring or if you want to partner with us for researching, examining how to find these good managers and how to cast like a wider net, as Ben was saying, please do contact Ben to learn more about how the Skills Lab can support your work. Ben, we are getting to the end of our conversation. I hope truly like this is just one of many more conversations on this like very fascinating, impactful, relevant, timely work that you are doing with the Skills Lab team. Thank you everyone again for joining the conversation today. For us, it only makes sense because we know that people like you are working hard and smart on the topics that we discuss here.